What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore then run? Or maybe it stinks like rotten meat and crust and sugar over like syrup sweet. Or maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? On September 9th, 1925, an explosion occurred at the intersection here on Garland and Charlevoix on Detroit's southeast side. The ingredients? Racism in the form of a mob of 500 angry whites with one major objective, and that was to prevent Dr. Ossian Sweet, his wife Gladys, and daughter Iva from achieving the American dream of home ownership. I grew up in this house, and in 1975, at the age of 10, I learned of the saga of Dr. Ossian Sweet. So I learned about the story of Dr. Sweet in a very interesting way. It was the fall of 1975. The doorbell rings. My mother gets up to answer the door. She comes back and she says, "Herbert, it's the man from the paper. He wants to talk to you about the house." So my father looks at me and he says, "Send Danny." He says, "Do you know the history of the house?" I said, "Yeah, a black guy used to live here a long time ago. He killed a white guy and didn't go to jail." He writes a couple of things down, asks me a few more questions. He takes a picture and then he leaves. The following Monday, I get to school. The teacher, Miss Dorothy Barnes, she stands in front of the entire classroom and she says, "Hey everybody, we got a celebrity in our class." And then she opens up this newspaper article and it says, "Little has changed since the 25 trials." And in the middle of the article is the same picture that the reporter took. After school, I came home and I told my mother what happened. So she goes into the pantry and she comes out with this attaché case with all of these newspaper articles and clippings. And it's the story of Dr. Ossian Sweet.
Dr. Sweet's story started in the rolling hills of North Carolina. His grandfather, Remus Devon, and his great-grandfather, Edward Devon, they were slaves. Their slave owner was Alex Cromartie. And Alex Cromartie, of course, his family were slave owners, and they wanted to grow their farm. So they packed up the family, they packed up the slaves, and they moved them to Leon County, Florida. And so Alexander bought some land and he began his cotton plantation, where Ossian Sweet's family were on that plantation. Dora and Henry sent their son to Wilberforce because they wanted him to get an education, because black people in Florida could not get education. The laws that were on the books in the 1890s and the late 1800s, black people had no rights. They couldn't read, they couldn't write, as well as they couldn't share schools, they couldn't share waters, they couldn't be in the same location as white people. And they were a proud black people. They wanted their children to have an education. They wanted him to be better, to do better than their family. So they sent him to college at 15 years old to Wilberforce.
"1925 was an interesting time in America. It was called the Gilded Age. There was a lot going on. It was ragtime. The Harlem Renaissance, or the New Negro movement, was occurring at that time. And something else interesting was going on. It was this movement of the demographics, the racial demographics of the United States of America. It's called the Great Migration. African Americans were, for the first time in the history of the country, moving from the rural South into the urban cities in the South as well as in the North.
About 6 million Black people in southern states. Most of them, over half of them, will leave those southern states in the next 40 years. Many of those people will come to the city of Detroit because Detroit has experienced a boom in factory building.
Henry Ford and his new assembly line operation that called for more human resources in those factories. He was offering $5 a day for people to come to Detroit, Michigan and work in his factories to produce the Model T.
So instead of dozens of workers, he needs thousands of workers. The United States government has put a cap on immigration at this time. So there's not enough immigrants coming from overseas to fill all these positions. So he opens up the door for African Americans to leave the South and come to the city of Detroit. So this begins a small network of a Black community in the Lower East Side of the city of Detroit, in the area that's going to be known as Black Bottom. So they're going to be needing all the types of things that a person who's making a living wage will need. They need paint to paint their homes, they need bakeries to go to, they need clothing stores, and they need attorneys, and they need doctors.
Dr. Ossian Sweet saw an opportunity here. African Americans were coming to Detroit, Michigan, and they didn't have health care. So Dr. Sweet decides to come to Detroit, Michigan.
And the major hospitals in the city of Detroit are segregated. So African American doctors are establishing themselves as being able to provide medical care for a group of African Americans, many of which are able to afford medical care, but are being blocked from getting it at the main hospitals. And so a lot of these doctors are here and they're able to have a clientele that have been turned away from the medical establishment. And they're able to make good money and live a good life in providing medical care. But they're facing the same kind of discrimination that the African American populace at large is facing.
African American men didn't have that opportunity very often in 1915. And he had a responsibility. He felt that responsibility after he went to Howard University for med school and he came to Detroit, was pole mark of the Detroit Alumni Chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi. And he reached back. He wanted to do the best thing for his family. He wanted to be a role model for people in the community. And that was what the New Negro was about. That is what, after World War I, when African Americans fought in Europe and they saw how they were treated differently in France, and they realized when they came back that they deserved civil rights, that they deserved the rights that they were receiving over in England and France in their own country. It was all happening at that time, and Brother Sweet was right in the midst of that. And that brings us to this house.
And when he comes to Detroit, he decides to marry this young, vivacious, and beautiful lady by the name of Gladys Mitchell.
She was a quiet strength in her family and in Ossian's life. She lives with her mother and stepfather in a house in what's considered a white neighborhood. And she develops a kind of confidence and a comfort in that community that becomes, I think, important for the decision to move into the house of Garland and Charlevoix later.
He and Gladys Mitchell marry. They have a daughter by the name of Iva, and they decide to go house hunting. The challenge was that Black folk just couldn't get a mortgage in those days. So they had to find a home where they could buy it on land contract. So they located the house at 2905 Garland. They came over here during the spring of that year. They visited the house. They walked around the house to demonstrate their interest so that the people would know that they wanted to buy this home. What was the fear or what was the hesitation? Well, earlier that year, mob violence had reared its ugly heads in Detroit, Michigan. In fact, there were 3 incidents where African Americans were confronted with mob violence. Dr. A.L. Turner, one of the most prominent physicians in Detroit, Michigan at that time, he was one of the founders of the first Black hospital in Detroit, Michigan, Dunbar Hospital. Dr. A.L. Turner, in that month of June, decided to buy a house on Spokane Street. Later on that day, a mob of 900 to 1,000 angry whites surrounded his home with the goal of forcing him out. And they did. They destroyed his house. They blew out all of his windows, destroyed his furniture, and afterwards they pulled him out, put a gun to his head, and made him sign over the deed to the home. A gentleman by the name of John Fletcher ran into the same situation, as well as funeral home owner Bowling Bristol. He moved on American Street and suffered at the hands of the mob.
$80,000 Klan members in Michigan in 1925, 40,000 of them were in Detroit. 90% of the Detroit police force, 90% of the hires of the last 2 years were from Southern whites. So you had this whole combination going on of all these Southern whites coming up to Detroit for the jobs in the automotive industry. And then you also had African Americans coming, and you had this clash that took place.
With all of these incidents, Dr. Sweet comes up with a strategy. Instead of moving into the Garland house in the middle of the summer, he decides to wait at the end of the summer, when all of the school kids are going back to school. That day, he didn't come by himself. He left little Iva with Gladys's parents, and then he, Gladys, his brother Henry, his brother Otis, and 7 other members decided to move into the house. On September 8th, not much happened. A couple of gawkers, people walking about trying to find out what was going on, but not much occurred. But on September 9th, all hell broke loose. That day, by 8:30 in the evening, a mob of 500 angry whites gather around Dr. Sweet's house. As they gathered around the house, the men in the house began to bear arms, and they looked around to determine what they should do. Dr. Sweet, in the moment, was nervous. He was scared. He comes upstairs to the bedroom and he lays in the bed, filled with fear. And the thing that knocks him out of a trance is when somebody throws a stone into the house, and it goes right into the window, and it shards right on Dr. Sweet. Shortly thereafter, a volley of shots ring out of the house. Dr. Sweet goes downstairs, and when the smoke clears, the Detroit Police Department come in and arrest everybody and charges them with murder. The local branch of the NAACP decides to intervene. They come to Dr. Sweet's side. At that time, the president of the local branch was Reverend Robert Bradby, and they decide to identify a battery of African American attorneys to represent Dr. Sweet.
The Detroit branch NAACP had just been chartered about 13 years prior, in 1912. The NAACP took on the leadership for the Dr. Sweet incident to show that you could not have discrimination, and that we did not want it in this city, as it was a boom town, and individuals were coming from all over to make sure that they could access a new life in Detroit.
Almost at the same time, the national branch of the NAACP discovers the event. At that time, the executive director of the branch was James Weldon Johnson. The field director was Walter White. Johnson sends White to Detroit to find out exactly what happens in this particular incident. Walter White goes to meet with Dr. Sweet, and ultimately he meets with Reverend Bradby, and they come up with a strategy, realizing that if they put an all-black battery of attorneys before an all-white jury, they would be dead before they opened their mouths. So they did a national search, and they come up with this guy by the name of Clarence Darrell. When Darrell comes in and the prosecution convenes, The judge is none other than Frank Murphy, a young 33-year-old aspiring judge.
You have to understand, at that point in time, this case was dynamite, and most of the population of Detroit at that point in time was white, and none of the other judges wanted to handle the case because it was a political dynamite, and they were afraid to try the case. Murphy said he would take it in order to help him with that. This was a point in American history when liberalism was starting to come, progressives, that there had really not been that movement before. And he wanted to prove that liberals could give a fair trial. Clarence Darrow referred to him as the kindest and the most understanding judge of all time. And it was kind of like a mutual admiration society, because he being Judge Murphy, spoke of him as being almost Christ-like. And when I have to laugh, because I have excellent attorneys, and this is not a slam on any of them, but I can't say I've ever seen an attorney yet who is Christ-like. But I'll give Clarence Darrow his due with regard to that.
I think the NAACP's focusing of national attention, which Darrow brought, was an enormous benefit. Of course, you had a judge, Frank Murphy, who later went on to be on the U.S. Supreme Court. But I do think that the national attention caused the leadership here to be maybe on its best behavior as far as humanity.
Darrow comes into Detroit, Michigan, and he bases his whole case on a man's home is his castle. No matter what color they are, they still have the right to defend their property. The turning point in the case is when the defense calls Dr. Sweet to testify about the event. That day, Clarence Darrow was pretty quiet. His co-counsel, Arthur Garfield Hayes, decides to lead the questions for Dr. Sweet. Hayes asked Dr. Sweet, what did he think when he saw the mob? And Dr. Sweet responded, when I opened the door and I saw the mob, I realized that I was facing the same mob that had hounded my people throughout its entire history. In my mind, I was pretty confident of what I was up against. I had my back against the wall. I was filled with a peculiar fear, the fear of one who knows the history of my race. I know what mobs have done to my people before. With that testimony, Dr. Sweet begins to articulate the history and the spirit of the mob. He talks about the mob that destroyed Rosewood in 1923. He articulates with clarity the mob that obliterated Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. And then he even talks about that mob during the Red Summer of 1919 when he was a student at Howard University. But the instance that impacted the trial the most was when he talked about when he was a little boy, a 5-year-old boy in Bartow, Florida in 1901. He talked about that summer when he was on his way home one evening and a mob of angry whites had identified a 16-year-old black boy by the name of Fred Rochelle, and they lynched him because he was accused of raping and killing a white woman. Dr. Sweet articulated how they took him and they strapped him and chained him to a barrel, and at about 8 o'clock, they doused him with kerosene and set him afire. He talked about how Rochelle screamed and the noises and the smell of burning flesh, and he articulated it in such a way where for the first time the jury had an opportunity not to look out of the corner of the house on Garland and Charlevoix with white eyes, but to see the vivid reality of what Black people had to experience in the United States of America. Since 1892, more than 2,000 Black people had been lynched in this country, and Dr. Sweet articulated it with clarity. And that was the turning point of that case. After the prosecution and the defense rested, it went to the hands of the jury. And after a couple of days, the jury came back to Frank Murphy and said that they could not come to a decision, and the case was dismissed and declared a mistrial.
First heard of the case September of 1996, my first month of law school at Case Western Reserve University School of Law in Cleveland, Ohio. This is a case that really set up property rights for African Americans throughout this country. And it happened right here on the east side of Detroit.
Well, I studied it when I was in law school. In fact, my litigation class, there was a letter from Clarence Darrow to the university. Of course, he went to Michigan. And I read everything that I could then. And later, when I was the Wayne County prosecutor, I looked at the fact that there was not even an historic marker here to recognize the enormous impact of the case. And we had a large group of African American prosecutors. They came to me and they said, "We want to bring the National Black Prosecutors Convention to Detroit. Will you support us?" And I said, how about if we get the governor to designate the Sweet House with the state historic marker and have it dedicated when the convention is here? And that was how we landed the National Black Prosecutors Convention here in Detroit. And of course, you remember the day when the historic marker was dedicated.
My father came up here from Birmingham, Alabama, and bought a house on DeQuinder with his GI Bill. Worked in construction. It's because of Dr. Sweet. The Conant Gardens was an area on the east side of Detroit where African Americans bought. They weren't renting. They bought homes over there. But, they were modest homes, but they were their homes that they bought. And they worked hard. And their kids could see that if you do the right things, you can be a homeowner. You don't have to rent anywhere. You don't have to live in an apartment. And that was because of Dr. Sweet.
After reviewing this case and looking at it, I really think it was a microcosm of 1925 America. On the one hand, you have this pristine document, the Constitution of the United States, the Bill of Rights of the United States, and that's all at play in this trial. And that's due process under the law, equal protection under the law, and your right to a jury trial by your peers. But on the other hand, you've got the stain that is on America's soul, and that is the stain of slavery and what it has caused as far as the fear and the hate and the prejudice and inequality. And all of that was on display in this trial.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty.
Dr. Sweet has run a couple of times for public office. When he ran the second time, he had a formidable candidate, that being Charles Diggs, our very first African-American congressman from the state of Michigan.
One of the things I was going to accomplish was to make certain that the significance of this home was recognized by the city.
things that he would always do was read or recite the Emancipation Proclamation. And that was to get us to realize that we really are free.
I think this house should be restored, and I think the houses across the street should be restored, where the fellow was killed as part of the mob. I want people to be able to come out and say, this was where the mob was gathered. This was the upstairs window where the suite members looked out in fear with their lights out, the police standing out in front and not doing anything. You don't get that sense just reading it in a book. But when I sit here, the feelings I have every time I step in this house are so powerful as to what those family members must have been feeling. And it's just a reminder to us of we just can't let these kinds of things happen. Even though it was 1925, it doesn't feel that long ago.
As a child growing up, I tried to imagine what an angry white mob would look like in 1925. I would look out this window and try to imagine just a sea of hate, a sea of bigotry, a sea of rage. But no matter how much I tried, I could never imagine that, because Dr. Sweet fought that battle. And because of that, I stand on his shoulders. I tried to imagine those bricks coming through those windows. I tried to imagine him laying in that bed, Henry, in position right here. But I couldn't, and I'm grateful. While the old saying goes that the more things change, the more they stay the same, we know that, and we realize that we still have battles to continue to fight. Thank God for men and women like Dr. Ossian and Gladys Sweet.
Southern trees bearing strange fruit, light of the leaves and blood